Growing up in a small town, there was one person who was always a constant in my life. Emily. She wasn't just the girl next door. She was the first face I saw when I opened my eyes to the world. From kindergarten to high school, we were inseparable. If you asked anyone in our town, they'd say we were like peanut butter and jelly, always together, always a team. But there was a problem. While everyone else thought of us as best friends, I saw Emily as something much more. From the moment I understood what love was, I realized I loved her. Not in the way you love a childhood friend or a sibling, but in the way you lie awake at night, imagining a future with someone. I was in love with Emily for as long as I could remember. She, however, never saw me that way. Emily was radiant, the kind of girl who lit up every room she walked into. She had this effortless charm, the sort that made people laugh before she even finished telling a joke. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was beautiful in a way that made it hard to look at her sometimes without catching your breath. It was everything about her. Her laugh, her confidence, her way of making everyone feel special. And then there was me, her rock, her bestie, her go-to when things went wrong. I was the one she called at 2 a.m. when her heart got broken, or when she needed someone to rant to about her latest crush. And oh, did she have crushes. Emily was popular, and it seemed like every guy in school wanted to date her at one point or another. I'd watch her move from one boyfriend to the next, always playing the dutiful friend, always swallowing the lump in my throat when she'd ask, "Why can't I find a good guy, Jake? Why can't someone just love me for who I am?" The irony of it was almost unbearable. By the time we were in high school, it became clear that Emily would always be the center of my universe, while I'd remain in orbit, never quite close enough to touch. I tried to date other girls, because isn't that what you're supposed to do? But every date ended the same way. Me comparing them to Emily and finding them lacking. So I gave up. I resigned myself to being her best friend, to loving her from a distance, to being the guy she could always count on but never look at the way she looked at those other guys. When we graduated high school, I thought things might change. We both applied to the same university, her choice, not mine, and were ecstatic when we both got in. Emily was thrilled about the idea of staying close to home, but also excited to explore a new chapter of her life. I was just thrilled that I wouldn't lose her to some distant city. We moved into separate dorms on campus, but we might as well have been living together with how much time we spent together. Coffee runs between classes, late-night study sessions, movie marathons in her tiny dorm room. It felt like nothing had changed, even though everything technically had. And yet, as the months went on, I started to see something shift in Emily. It was subtle at first. She seemed more reserved, quieter when we were alone. She started dating again, but this time it felt different. She didn't gush about the guys like she used to. If anything, she avoided talking about them altogether. I didn't press her on it. Why would I? The last thing I wanted was to hear more about some guy who would inevitably break her heart. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a crisp autumn evening, and Emily had dragged me to yet another campus party. Parties weren't my thing, but they were hers, and if it meant spending time with her, I wasn't going to say no. We ended up sitting on the porch steps, away from the noise, just the two of us. She was quiet that night, which wasn't like her. Usually, Emily could talk for hours about anything and everything, but tonight she seemed distracted. Finally, she turned to me, her blue eyes sparkling in the moonlight. "Jake," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like no matter what you do, you're just waiting for something to happen, but it never does?" I frowned, not sure where she was going with this. "I guess," I said carefully. "Why? Is something wrong?" She shook her head, but her expression was unreadable. "No, nothing's wrong. I don't know. I feel like I've been blind to a lot of things." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but before I could, someone called her name from inside the house. She stood up, brushing off her jeans, and flashed me a smile. "Come on, let's go back in. It's freezing out here." And just like that, the moment was gone. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. What it was, I didn't know yet. After that night on the porch, I couldn't stop replaying Emily's words in my head. "I feel like I've been blind to a lot of things. What did she mean? Was it just a passing thought? Or was there something deeper she was trying to say? I told myself not to overthink it, but that's easier said than done when you've spent most of your life hoping the girl of your dreams might, one day, see you the way you see her. The days that followed were strange. Emily seemed quieter, more introspective, but she still made time for me. We had our usual coffee runs, our study sessions, but there were these little moments where she'd just stop and look at me, really look at me, like she was searching for something. It was unnerving. And then came the party. It was a Friday night, and Emily insisted we go to another one of those off-campus gatherings. I wasn't exactly thrilled. I'd never been the life of the party type, but she promised it would be low-key. I should have known better. We arrived at the house around 9, and the music was already blaring. Emily immediately dove into the crowd, greeting friends and grabbing drinks. I hung back, nursing a soda and watching her move through the room like she owned it. She was magnetic, as always, laughing and joking with everyone she met. An hour or so later, I found myself on the back patio, avoiding the chaos inside. I was staring up at the stars, lost in thought, when I heard her voice behind me. "There you are," she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "I've been looking for you." I raised an eyebrow. "You've been looking for me? You seemed pretty busy in there." She rolled her eyes and plopped down next to me on the bench. "You know I hate when you do that." "Do what?" "Act like I don't care about you." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I didn't mean it like that," I said finally. She sighed, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I know. I don't know, Jake. Lately, I feel like everything's changing, and I'm scared I'm going to mess it all up." "Mess what up?" I asked, genuinely confused. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. "Us," she said quietly. My heart stopped. She'd said it like it was something real, something more than just friendship. But before I could process what she meant, she shook her head and laughed, breaking the moment. "Sorry," she said, standing up. "I'm being weird. Let's go back inside." And just like that, she was gone again, leaving me more confused than ever. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was bubbling beneath the surface. Emily's words, her looks, the way she'd been acting. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know how to put together. That day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I showed up at her dorm unannounced, armed with 2 coffees and the determination to figure out what was going on. She opened the door, looking surprised but not unhappy to see me. "Jake," she said, her voice warm. "What are you doing here?" I handed her the coffee and stepped inside. "We need to talk." She raised an eyebrow, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sat down on her bed and patted the spot next to her. "Okay," she said. "Talk." I hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to start. "I feel like there's been something you're not telling me," I said finally. Her expression shifted, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny it. But then she sighed and looked down at her coffee cup. "You're right," she said. I waited, my heart pounding, as she took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she said slowly, "about us, about what we mean to each other." "And," I prompted, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me then, her eyes full of uncertainty. "And I think I've been lying to myself for a long time," she said. "I think I've been so scared of losing you that I convinced myself we could only ever be friends. But the truth is, I don't think I can imagine my life without you. Not like this." Felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For years, I dreamed of hearing her say those words, but now that she had, I didn't know how to respond. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "Say something." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I reached for her hand, holding it tightly in mine. "I've been waiting for you to say that for as long as I can remember," I said finally. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw a vulnerability in her that I'd never seen before. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if we ruin everything?" "We won't," I said firmly. We've been through too much to let that happen. She smiled then, a real, genuine smile, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could have the happy ending I'd always dreamed of. But of course, life has a way of complicating even the best of beginnings. After that morning in her dorm room, everything between Emily and me began to change. It wasn't some sudden, dramatic shift, no fireworks or romantic movie montages. It was more like the slow melting of a thick layer of ice. All the barriers we'd built over the years, the unspoken rules about staying just friends, started to crumble. First, it was tentative. We didn't tell anyone, not even our closest friends. Emily said she wanted to figure things out between us before we had to deal with the opinions of everyone else. I was fine with that. Honestly, I was just happy to be by her side, knowing that, for the first time, she was looking at me the way I'd always dreamed she would. We eased into it. Instead of hanging out as best friends, we started spending time as whatever we were now. The little things felt different. The way she'd brush her hand against mine as we walked across campus. How she'd lean her head on my shoulder during a late-night study session. The way her laugh seemed to linger a little longer when we were together. But there were also moments of uncertainty. Emily wasn't used to letting her guard down with me in this new way, and I wasn't sure how far to push. One evening, we were sitting on her couch watching an old movie. I had my arm draped over the back of the couch, and she was curled up next to me. Felt natural, comfortable. And then she turned to me, her face serious. "Jake," she said softly. "Are you sure about this? About us?" I was startled by the question. "Of course I'm sure," I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" She looked down, twisting the edge of her sleeve between her fingers. "Because I'm scared," she admitted. "I've hurt people before, Jake. I don't want to hurt you." "You won't," I said firmly, reaching for her hand. "Emily, I've known you my entire life. I know who you are and I know what we have. This feels right." She smiled, though it was faint. "I don't want to mess this up," she said. "You won't," I repeated. "And even if we hit some bumps, we'll figure it out. Together." Her smile grew then, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the confidence she'd always carried, the one that had drawn me to her in the first place. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm. We'd meet for lunch between classes, sneaking moments together in the crowded cafeteria. She started calling me late at night, not because she was upset about another guy, but just because she wanted to hear my voice. One day, she showed up outside my dorm with 2 cups of coffee and a mischievous grin. "Get dressed," she said. "For what?" I asked, confused. "It's a surprise," she said, already pulling me toward the door. She drove us to a small park on the edge of town, the kind of place you'd only know about if you'd grown up in the area. It was quiet, the autumn leaves painting the ground in shades of orange and gold. We walked along the trail, laughing and talking about nothing in particular, until we reached a small clearing with a wooden bench overlooking the water. "This used to be my favorite spot when I was a kid," she said, sitting down. "Whenever things got hard at home, I'd come here to think. It's beautiful. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference," I said, sitting beside her. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've never brought anyone here before," she admitted. "Why now?" I asked, my voice soft. She turned to me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Because you're different, Jake," she said. "You've always been different." We sat there in silence for a long time, her hand resting in mine. In that moment, I felt like I could stay there forever. Of course, not everything was perfect. Emily had her doubts, and so did I. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering if I was enough for her. She was Emily, after all, bright, beautiful, the girl every guy wanted. And I was just me. But then there were moments when she'd look at me, really look at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Those moments made all the doubts disappear. One night, as we walked back to her dorm after a late study session, she stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Jake," she said, her voice serious. "Yeah." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't think I ever told you how much you mean to me," she said finally. You don't have to, I said, smiling. I already know. No, you don't, she said, shaking her head. You've always been there for me, Jake. Always. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, I said, pulling her into a hug. In that moment, I felt like we could handle anything. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. Things between Emily and me were going well. Better than I'd ever dared to hope. We had found a rhythm, a balance that felt almost effortless. I thought we were solid, unshakable. But then came the night that tested everything. It all started with a group project for one of Emily's marketing classes. She'd been paired with a guy named Ryan, one of those annoyingly perfect types. Tall, charming, always dressed like he was about to step onto the cover of a college brochure. I didn't know much about him, but I'd seen the way people gravitated toward him in the cafeteria and around campus. When Emily told me they'd been paired together, I tried to play it cool. That's great, I said, forcing a smile. He seems competent. She rolled her eyes. Relax, Jake. It's just a project. Besides, you're the only one I care about. Her words reassured me for about 5 minutes. But then the late nights started. Emily and Ryan were working on their project almost every evening. Sometimes they'd be in the library, other times in one of the study rooms on campus. She kept me updated, texting me throughout the night to let me know how things were going. At first, I told myself it was fine. She was just doing what she needed to do to get a good grade. But as the nights stretched on, my patience and my confidence began to wear thin. One evening, around 10 p.m., I texted her to see how things were going. Still working. Ryan's really detail-oriented, which is good but also exhausting, she replied. Don't stay too late, I texted back. I won't. Promise. I tried to focus on my own work, but my mind kept drifting. What were they doing? What was Ryan saying to her? Was he trying to be charming to impress her? By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I texted again. No response. At 1 a.m., I called her. Straight to voicemail. Panic and jealousy twisted together in my chest. Was she okay? Or was something else going on? I barely slept that night, and by morning, I was a mess. Around 8 a.m., I finally got a text from her. Jake, I'm so sorry. I fell asleep at Ryan's. I didn't mean to worry you. Fell asleep. At Ryan's. My stomach churned as I reread her message. Without replying, I grabbed my jacket and headed straight for her dorm. When she opened the door, she looked terrible. Her hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Jake, she said, her voice soft. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. Didn't mean to what? I snapped. Spend the night at Ryan's? Forget to call me? Leave me sitting here wondering what the hell happened. Her face crumpled, and for a second, I felt like the worst person in the world. But I couldn't help it. The thought of her being with Ryan, even innocently, drove me crazy. Nothing happened, she said quickly. I swear. We were working late, and I must have fallen asleep at the desk. When I woke up, it was morning. I didn't even realize. Do you know how that looks? I interrupted. Do you have any idea how that made me feel? Her eyes filled with tears. I know, Jake. I know. I messed up. But you have to believe me. There's nothing going on between me and Ryan. You're the only one I care about. You have to know that. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the jealousy was still burning in my chest. Why didn't you call me? I asked, my voice quieter now. I didn't think, she admitted. I was so focused on the project, and then, I don't know, I just screwed up. I'm so sorry. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. Finally, she stepped closer, reaching for my hand. Jake, I'm sorry. I hate that I hurt you. Please, don't let this ruin us. I hesitated, my mind racing. But as I looked into her eyes, filled with regret and fear, I felt my anger start to ebb. I need time, I said finally, to process this. But I'm not giving up on us. She nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Over the next few days, Emily went out of her way to prove that I was her priority. She cut back on her time with Ryan, working on the project in public spaces and always keeping me in the loop. She apologized more times than I could count, and eventually, I started to believe her. One night, as we sat on the couch in her dorm, she turned to me and said, "I never want you to feel like you're second to anyone, Jake. You're my person. Always." I didn't say anything, but I pulled her close, holding her tightly as if to prove to myself that she was still mine. We'd weathered our first real storm, and we came out the other side stronger. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that life had more challenges in store for us. The months after the Ryan incident were some of the happiest times of my life. Once we patched things up, it felt like Emily and I became stronger, more connected. We had our routines, coffee runs before classes, late-night study sessions, and lazy Sundays spent walking through the park or binge-watching TV shows. For the first time, I truly felt like I had everything I'd ever wanted. Emily was no longer just my best friend. She was my partner, my person, and she made me feel like I was hers too. There were small moments that I cherished, little things that reminded me why I'd loved her for so long. Like how she'd doodle hearts in the margins of my notebooks when I wasn't paying attention. Or the way she'd lean into me during cold nights at campus events, stealing my jacket and insisting it was just for a few minutes. Even though we both knew she wasn't giving it back, we started talking about the future, imagining what life might look like after graduation. Emily dreamed of moving to a big city, starting her career in marketing. I wasn't as sure about what I wanted, but I knew one thing: I wanted to be wherever she was. Everything felt so solid, so certain. But as we entered our final year of university, something started to shift. It began subtly. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Emily would cancel plans more often, saying she had too much homework or was too tired to meet up. When we did spend time together, she seemed distracted, her mind somewhere else. One night, as we sat in her dorm room watching a movie, I noticed she wasn't laughing at the funny parts like she usually did. Instead, she was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Yeah," she said quickly, setting her phone down. "Just a lot on my mind with school and stuff." I nodded, not wanting to press her. But something about her tone didn't sit right with me. The distance between us grew slowly but steadily. Emily started spending more time with her classmates, going to study groups and social events that she didn't invite me to. I told myself it was normal. After all, it was our last year and everyone was busy. But then there were moments I couldn't ignore. One evening, we were having dinner at a campus cafe, and she seemed quieter than usual. I tried to make conversation, asking her about her classes and how her internship was going. She answered politely but didn't elaborate, her attention fixed on her plate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Emily, support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference," I said, setting down my fork. "What's going on?" She looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant," I said carefully. "Lately, it feels like you're pulling away from me." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not you, Jake. I'm just stressed about school. That's all." "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Because it feels like more than that." She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say something important. But then she shook her head. "I promise it's just school," she said, forcing a smile. "Don't worry, okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. As the semester went on, the cracks in our relationship became harder to ignore. Emily would cancel dates at the last minute, saying she had group meetings or projects to work on. When we were together, she seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly or zoning out mid-conversation. One night, after another canceled plan, I decided to talk to her about it. I waited outside her dorm, catching her as she came back from class. "Jake," she said, surprised to see me. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice tense. "Now?" she said, glancing at her watch. "Yes, now," I said. "Emily, I can't keep pretending everything's fine. You're not the same and it's affecting us." She looked away, her shoulders slumping. "Jake, I'm sorry," she said. I don't mean to make you feel like this. I'm just overwhelmed. With school, with everything. I don't have the energy to be a good girlfriend right now. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. A good girlfriend? I repeated. Emily, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to let me in. She sighed, looking exhausted. I'm trying, Jake. I really am. But I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know how to fix it. I didn't know what to say to that. For years, I'd been the one to pick her up when she was struggling, to help her carry whatever burdens she couldn't handle on her own. But now, for the first time, it felt like she didn't want my help. The rest of the semester was a roller coaster. Some days it felt like we were back to normal, laughing, talking, stealing kisses between classes. But other days, the distance between us felt insurmountable. By the time winter break rolled around, I didn't know where we stood. Emily went home to visit her family, and while we texted occasionally, the messages were short and perfunctory. I tried to tell myself it was just a rough patch, that things would get better once the new semester started. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. When we returned to campus for our final semester, the tension between us was undeniable. Emily was more distant than ever, and no matter how hard I tried to reach her, it felt like she was building walls I couldn't break through. Our late-night conversations turned into awkward silences. Our weekends together turned into weekends apart. The relationship that had once felt so solid now felt like it was hanging by a thread. And no matter how much I wanted to fix it, I didn't know how. The tension between Emily and me had grown to the point where every interaction felt like walking on eggshells. The spark we once had seemed like a distant memory, replaced by an unspoken but ever-present sense of disconnect. Still, I clung to the hope that we could salvage what we had. One day, I had to meet with a professor to discuss retaking an exam I had missed earlier in the semester. The class was notoriously difficult, and I couldn't afford to fail, so I scheduled a time to talk with him during his office hours. It was late in the afternoon, and the hallway outside his office was unusually quiet. The other faculty offices were dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I approached his door, which was slightly ajar, and knocked lightly. "Professor Carter?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open further. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Emily was there. She was sitting on the professor's desk, her back to me, completely naked. Her long hair fell in loose waves down her bare shoulders, and her legs dangled off the edge of the desk. Professor Carter, also partially undressed, was standing between her knees, his hands on her hips as he leaned in to kiss her. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake. A trick of the light, a misunderstanding, anything but what it so clearly was. But the longer I stood there, the more undeniable it became. Emily was laughing softly, a sound I used to love, but now felt like a dagger to my heart. The intimacy between them was evident in every movement, every touch. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. A wave of nausea swept over me, and my legs felt like they might give out. My chest tightened as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. How could she do this? How could she do this to me? The betrayal was so visceral, so overwhelming, that it felt like my heart was being ripped from my chest. And then the anger came. It burned hot and fierce, cutting through the pain like a knife. My hands shook as I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the camera. If they thought they could humiliate me, destroy everything we'd built together, they were wrong. I hit record, my thumb trembling against the screen. The image on my phone's display was clear. Emily and Professor Carter, completely oblivious to my presence, wrapped up in their betrayal. I wanted to scream, to yell, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. My world was collapsing in on itself, and all I could do was stand there, capturing the moment my life fell apart. Finally, unable to bear another second of it, I stopped recording and turned to leave. My footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway as I walked away, but they didn't call after me. They didn't even know I'd been there. By the time I reached the exit, I could feel the tears streaming down my face. My heart felt shattered beyond repair, and the pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The girl I had loved my entire life, the one I thought I'd spend forever with, had destroyed everything in an instant. I don't remember how I made it out of the building. My mind was a swirling mess of anger, disbelief, and gut-wrenching pain. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me away from the scene that had just shattered my world. The phone in my hand felt like it weighed a ton, the video still open on the screen. I stopped outside, leaning against a brick wall, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The memory of what I had just seen played on an endless loop in my mind. Emily, my Emily, and him, her soft laughter, the way she leaned into him, it was burned into my brain like a cruel brand. I stared at the video, my thumb hovering over the delete button, but the anger inside me, that raw, unrelenting fury, wouldn't let me do it. Why should I erase it? Why should I let her and that disgusting excuse for a professor get away with this? No, they deserved to face the consequences of their actions. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Without fully thinking it through, I opened the university's main social media group. It was a hub where students and staff shared everything from class updates to memes. I hesitated for a brief moment, the tiniest shred of doubt creeping in. But then I hit upload, attaching the video with a caption that read, "So this is what professionalism looks like in our university." My heart pounded in my chest as the video began to upload. It felt like an eternity before the little progress bar reached 100%. And then it was done. I stood there, staring at the screen as the notifications started pouring in. Comments, reactions, shares, each one a confirmation that I had just unleashed a storm. The fallout was immediate and devastating. By the time I returned to my dorm, the video had already gone viral within the university. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from classmates, friends, and even people I barely knew. Some were shocked, others outraged, and a few even sent me messages of support. The first public response came from the administration. An email was sent to all students and faculty within hours, announcing that Professor Carter had been suspended pending an investigation. By the end of the day, another email followed. Professor Carter is no longer employed by the university. It wasn't just his career that ended that day. The whispers about Emily started almost immediately. By the next morning, she was the subject of every conversation on campus. The girl who had once been admired, envied even, was now the center of a scandal that no one could stop talking about. I avoided her. I couldn't face her, not after what I had seen. But Emily didn't avoid me. The first message came late that night. "Jake, please can we talk? I need to explain." I didn't reply. Then came the calls. One after another, her name lighting up my screen over and over again. I let them all go to voicemail, refusing to hear her excuses. But she didn't give up. The next day, she showed up at my dorm. "Jake," she said as soon as I opened the door, her voice trembling. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Please, can we talk?" I stared at her, the pain and betrayal crashing over me like a wave. "There's nothing to talk about," I said coldly. "Please," she begged, stepping closer. "You don't understand. It's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and sharp in the quiet hallway. "Not what it looks like." Really? Because from where I was standing, it looked pretty clear. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. "It was a mistake," she said desperately. I wasn't thinking straight. It didn't mean anything. "Jake, you have to believe me." I crossed my arms, my expression as cold as my voice. "Why should I believe anything you say? You lied to me. You destroyed everything we had." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But you did," I said, my tone flat. "You made your choices, Emily, and now you have to live with them." She started to cry then, the sound raw and heartbreaking, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I stood there, stone-faced, as she pleaded for my forgiveness. "Please, Jake." she said through her tears. I love you. Don't, I interrupted sharply. Don't you dare say that. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Her sobs grew louder, but I turned and walked back into my room, shutting the door behind me. The sound of her crying on the other side was muffled but still audible. I stood there for a long moment, my back against the door, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness that I couldn't even begin to untangle. Eventually, her cries faded, and I heard the sound of her footsteps as she walked away. I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. Part of me wanted to scream, to smash something, to do anything to let out the unbearable weight of what I was feeling. But instead, I just sat there in silence, wondering how everything had gone so horribly wrong. In the days following the scandal, Emily's life unraveled at a pace that was both shocking and, in a strange way, inevitable. The video had spread far beyond the confines of our university group. It was on every social media platform, shared and reshared by students, alumni, and even strangers who had no idea who Emily or Professor Carter were. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, and her face, a face I had once loved so deeply, was now the subject of countless memes, insults, and cruel jokes. At first, Emily tried to weather the storm. She went to classes, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact with anyone. But the whispers followed her wherever she went. Is that her? I can't believe she did that. Did you see the video? It's even worse than I thought. The judgment wasn't just from students. Professors, once friendly and supportive, now treated her with thinly veiled disdain. Group projects were suddenly full, leaving Emily to work alone. Even the staff at the campus cafe started serving her with cold indifference, their usual smiles replaced by awkward silence. One afternoon, about a week after everything had blown up, I saw her on campus. She was sitting on a bench outside the library, her hair pulled into a messy bun and her face pale and drawn. Her phone was in her lap, buzzing with notifications she didn't bother to check. I watched from a distance as a group of students passed by, their laughter cutting through the air. One of them pointed at her, saying something I couldn't hear, and the others burst into cruel laughter. Emily didn't react. She just sat there, staring blankly ahead as if she couldn't even hear them. Her social circle disintegrated almost overnight. Friends who used to hang out with her regularly stopped answering her calls. Her closest confidants, girls who had shared secrets, laughs, and late-night study sessions, now avoided her like she carried some kind of contagious disease. Even Ryan, the classmate she'd worked with on that infamous project, seemed to distance himself. I overheard someone say that he'd been telling people he had no idea about her relationship with Professor Carter, trying to clear his own name before the gossip could tarnish it. Emily's family wasn't spared from the fallout either. Her parents, proud alumni of the university, had always been active in its events and fundraising efforts. Now, they were the subject of hushed conversations and sympathetic head shakes. I heard from a mutual friend that her mother had called Emily in tears after someone from their church forwarded her the video. Emily hadn't just humiliated herself. She'd humiliated them, too. By the second week, she had stopped attending classes altogether. I found out from a friend that she'd moved out of her dorm, retreating to her parents' house in the hopes of escaping the constant judgment. But even there, she wasn't safe. Her parents had tried to shield her from the worst of it, but the internet doesn't forget. People started leaving cruel comments on her old social media posts, digging up pictures from happier times and twisting them into mockery. No wonder she's smiling. She was probably planning her next move with the professor. Guess we know how she gets those grades. One post went particularly viral. A photo of her at a campus event from earlier in the year, smiling and holding a plaque for academic excellence. Someone had added the caption, "Top student in extracurricular activities." Emily deleted her accounts the next day. The last I heard, her internship, a position she had worked so hard to secure, had been quietly terminated. They didn't give her a reason, but it wasn't hard to guess. Her name was toxic now, a black mark that no employer would want to be associated with. I should have felt some satisfaction, some sense of justice in seeing her face the consequences of her actions. After all, hadn't she destroyed everything we had? But instead I felt empty. This wasn't the Emily I had grown up with, the girl who had once been my best friend, my confidant, my everything. The person I saw now, broken and alone, was a shadow of the person I'd loved. One night, I got a message from an unknown number. "Jake, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I just need you to know how sorry I am. I hate what I've done to you, to us. Please, if there's any way we can talk, I need to try and make this right." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell her how much she had hurt me, how her actions had torn my world apart. But another part of me, the part that still felt the sting of her betrayal, couldn't bring myself to give her the closure she was asking for. I locked my phone and went to bed. The campus moved on, as it always does. New scandals replaced the old, and Emily became just another cautionary tale. A name whispered in hallways, but eventually forgotten. But for me, forgetting wasn't so easy. After everything fell apart, I knew I had to start over. Staying on campus, surrounded by the memories of Emily and the fallout of the scandal, wasn't an option. I threw myself into my studies, determined to focus on what mattered, my future. For the first time in years, my world wasn't centered on her. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected and started going out more, even joining a few clubs I'd always been too busy to consider. Slowly, the weight of what had happened began to lift. Graduation came faster than I expected, and with it, a new chapter. I moved to a different city for a job, a place where no one knew my story or the mess I'd left behind. It felt freeing, like I was finally getting the clean slate I needed. I even started dating again, cautiously at first. Trust didn't come easy after everything with Emily, but I reminded myself that not everyone would hurt me the way she did. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what lay ahead. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.